Thanks very much, everyone. I am honored to be here. I apologize for my accent. Hopefully you'll be able to follow me. It's a very serious topic, but I hope we'll also have a little fun as we go through this. I'm going to start off, did that backwards. I'm going to start off with a quote that my co-author, Ted Thomas, who teaches at Fort Leavenworth at the General Command and Staff College and is head of leadership, design, and instruction there. We wrote an article on intelligent disobedience last year, which is how we came to the attention of Lloyd and others here. And in it, we quote the Army Chief of Staff, and you see here that he asserts that the willingness to disobey specific orders to achieve the intended purpose, the willingness to take risks to meet the intent, the acceptance of failure and practice in order to learn from experimentation, these are all going to have to be elevated in the pantheon of leader traits. And I think that's what you heard the Commandant really raise up as a value here. Well, we were very chuffed that this senior Army officer would raise the willingness to disobey to that level, because we thought, well, certainly this is showing a change, a transformation in the traditional military. But before we get too self-complimentary, in my research for today's talk, I found another quote that I'm going to share with you. Blind obedience, nothing is more fatal to efficiency in an army than a fear of responsibility on the part of its higher officers. Nothing is more likely to instill such fear ineradicably into an officer's blood than long years of blind obedience in lower grades. No man who has obeyed blindly all his life will ever in a crisis disobey intelligently. Generally, he will not disobey at all. He will be afraid of the responsibility of success, and he will obey from habit and fail from the same cause. Now, if that language seems slightly archaic, and by the way, does not embrace all genders, that's because it was written in a different era. In fact, it was written over 110 years ago in the United States Infantry Association Journal. Now, if over 100 years ago the importance of disobedience was that understood, and yet the difficulty of knowing what is appropriate obedience and inappropriate obedience, if it's taken this long that we're now having a conference on it, there's clearly some things we need to delve into and understand about obedience and disobedience to make it a reality. So I'm going to start with some definitions, and then I'm going to cycle back to the context in which this topic emerged. I'm going to draw on a couple of authors who write on authority relationships, and I'm paraphrasing their definitions. Appropriate obedience contains three elements. If the system is reasonably just, the leader has legitimate authority and competence, and the order will not produce unnecessary harm, then it is appropriate to obey. So there's actually a structure there. Now, in contrast to that, intelligent disobedience is resistance to an order if the leader lacks the legitimate authority to issue the order, or the order will produce avoidable harm. Now, this is a very narrow definition, and I'm going to contrast it with a broader definition in a moment. Because intelligent disobedience is not a common term, at least in the US, when people hear it, they think, is this civil disobedience? I don't know if the same association is made here or not. So let's make sure we understand that it is not civil disobedience, and what is the distinction? So the distinction is that in civil disobedience, the system itself is perceived to have some injustice in it. And therefore, a decision is made to publicly violate a law or a rule with the express intention of bringing public attention to that in the hopes of getting it changed. So civil disobedience has an honorable history in terms, for example, of our civil rights movement in the US, in apartheid in South Africa, etc. But that is not what we're talking about here today. So I need to be very, very clear about that. We're talking about a narrower topic. The system is reasonably just. The question then, and your superior officers are reasonably competent and legitimate. So the question is, what about if the order itself is not a good order to implement, not because of lack of competence, but it could be that the senior officer is missing the data that you on the ground have. And they need to understand that data in order to evaluate, is that the order that should be executed? So with that in mind, I'm going to now give you the background. As Lloyd said, my earlier book, written about 20 years ago, is called The Courageous Follower. We're all expected to be leaders, but in reality, we are also all followers. Whatever rank you are, you both lead and you follow. And if you didn't follow reasonably well, you would never get to a senior leadership rank. So culturally, we don't honor followership as much as leadership, but in fact, they're inextricable. They're two parts of the same process. I teach courageous followership to senior federal government executives, careerists, at our Federal Executive Institute. These are drawn from all of our different, what you would call ministries, and they include all of our Department of Defense as well as our civilian agencies. And one of the things we talk about is authority, how most of the time it makes sense to comply with what authority asks you to do. But sometimes, perhaps rarely, but sometimes it doesn't, because the authority figure is missing important information. And if you executed the order, it would have an unintended harmful result. One of the women in my class raised her hand, and she said, I have an example of this under the table. What could she possibly have under the table? She had a dog under the table. This dog was so well trained and behaved that I didn't even notice it. And she explained that the dog was being trained to be a guide dog for a blind person, and that it would spend the first 18 months of its life with her family, and their job was to socialize it so it could stay as quiet as it was, and to teach it every command it would need to know in order to serve and keep a blind person safe. After that 18-month period, she said it goes to a higher level trainer to teach it intelligent disobedience. I never heard that term. I said, what is that? She said, well, think about it. If the dog is given an instruction to go forward, and there's a quiet hybrid car coming around the corner that the blind person didn't hear, if it executed the command, it could get them killed. So it must be able to distinguish between what orders to obey and which to disobey, even if they're repeated. And at that moment I thought, if we can teach dogs this, right, you got it. So that began my investigation of what does it take? What does it take to teach this? Because just think about it for a moment. After you've spent the dog's entire formative years that teaching it must obey, how do you teach it when and how not to obey without confusing it? And there's an art to it. I'm going to give you an example here. This was another student of mine who we were actually, she was in a doctoral program, but she told me a story, she told the class a story, of when she was a young nurse fresh out of nursing school. And she was assigned to an emergency room, and a cardiac patient was rushed in. And the attending physician quickly examined the patient and ordered her to administer a certain drug. And she was startled. She had been taught that that drug was contraindicated in this situation and could, in fact, be lethal. Now put yourself in her position for a moment. She's a young nurse. Here's a physician, rank, training, experience, even her job was on the line. But if she executed the order, knowing that her training told her that was the wrong drug, and this patient was severely impaired or even killed, what would that consequence be? Put yourself in that situation for a moment. She said, "Doctor, I was trained this is not the right drug for this situation." And he said, "You just do what I said." He was busy. He had lots of patients. Maybe he hadn't slept for a while. You see? So he thought he was doing the right thing. What would you do in that situation? Here's what she did. She hooked up the IV with the medication he prescribed, and she called him over and she said, "Doctor, the medication is ready to be delivered. My training tells me that it's not right. If you are sure it's right, you will need to turn the valve." And that was enough to get him to reconsider and give a safer instruction. So that's an example of how we have to be able to, it's not just obey or disobey, but we need to maintain the presence of mind to help the leadership that has issued the order really consider its impact. And that varies depending on the immediacy and the urgency, the time available. All right, with that as a framework, we're talking about authority. Authority is not the same as leadership. We hope that those in authority have good leadership skills. That's what Sandhurst is all about. But it isn't necessarily so. Authority is, very narrowly the power or the right to make decisions, give orders, and enforce obedience. Now, with that in mind, we have to think about what do we need to understand about authority. In any complex organization, like a military organization or a civilian organization. I'm going to draw on another book here. It's called Don't Kill the Bosses, Escaping the Hierarchy Trap. And this book, I think, gives us one very good distinction. I'm going to start with what we understand, and it's their definition of authority structures. And these are the roles that are assigned that clarify who can make what decision, who can sign off on what level of budget, of operation, etc. And when those roles are clear, then that promotes the orderly business of the group. So authority structures are they're not the problem. They're necessary in any large, complex organization. So that's not the problem. Well, what is the problem then with authority? And these authors create a distinction between structures and relationships. And they define authority relationships as the internal rules that we carry around about authority. How do I believe I am entitled or allowed to speak to people in authority positions above me? How, as an authority figure, do I feel I'm entitled to speak to those below me? Those are never written, those rules, but they're very powerful. And those are the rules that can inhibit the free flow of professional information that is necessary for the best decision making. So, where do these internal rules come from if they're not written anywhere? They come from quite a number of places. They start with the family of origin. Some of you come from families where you always call adults Mr. and Mrs. Some of you have different rules in your family of origin. You all went to school. You could not actually get through school if you didn't learn the rules of obedience. They're necessary. We have to socialize our children. But we can socialize them too strongly. And I'm going to go into that in a moment. We then reinforce those rules in all the extracurricular activities, sports, etc., that our children are part of. And then we have the macro rules that come from religious practice. And again, those vary significantly, particularly in a multicultural society, as well as the cultures that people bring from their different ethnic backgrounds. All of this is then reinforced by indoctrination. When one enters a large organization, there's always some sort of an indoctrination process. And whether or not the rules are explicit, there are always the implicit rules, which we call norms. We watch how do people behave, and we learn to follow those unwritten rules. We also pay very strong attention to the penalties for deviance. Look what happened to him when he spoke up. I don't think I'm going to speak up. These rules remain somewhat out of our full conscious control and decision making. And that's what creates much of the problem that we have in terms of authority relationships. I said I was going to go back to the school piece. Part of my research when I was writing the book took me into the early childhood education. I'm not an educator, not an early childhood educator, so I relied on guidance from colleagues who are. And I said, what are the main books that are used and programs to teach teachers? And in the US, there are certain books that have been used to train millions of teachers. So I read these books, and the common theme was that classroom management of the behavior of every individual in your class was more important than education. Because if you lost control of the discipline of the class, the theory was you couldn't educate. So therefore, teachers were taught within sort of an inch of their lives how to almost strike terror into the hearts of their children if they disobeyed. And one of these books states that any discipline management technique that's actually working should self-eliminate. What does that mean? It means that the student internalizes the rules for obedience so fully that even when the authority figure's not there, they are following those rules. This is a very deep level of programming. In some ways, it serves our culture well, but it goes too far, and what I'm arguing is that if we go back to the guide dog metaphor, the guide dog is also taught to obey everything it needs to obey, but then it is taught the exceptions. I'm arguing that we don't teach the exceptions and that we need to. So I'm going to show you a video now which shows how these rules go too far.
You're on Candid Camera. No, you're not, actually. But my first guest tonight is the man who ran those tests we just showed you, where people meekly did things like lie down on the conveyor belt of what they thought was an airport x-ray machine, simply because he told them to. Let's show some more of it. It's pretty amazing.
Okay, just leaning forward, hands straight ahead of you. You don't have to climb in, I'll take care of it. Hands straight forward, head down. Here we go, are you all set? Lift your leg just a bit. Okay, put your legs down, legs down, legs down. Here we go now.
The airport screener on that tape was Peter Funt of Candid Camera, who joins us now. And you've done a lot of these tests over the years. It bothers you sometimes that people obeyed you?
It scares me, far beyond bother. I should point out, though, John, I think it's important, that airport gag was done a few months before 9/11.
Yeah, 1 month, actually.
Yeah,
couldn't do that now.
Well, and I don't think I'd want to. You know, airport security back then was kind of laughable. And some think it's laughable now, but for entirely different reasons, and that's a whole other story. But we were simply there not to test security at an airport, but to demonstrate once again, as we have many times on Candid Camera, the power of authority and the way people will obey without thinking.
Only one person said, no, I'm not going to go on the belt.
We photographed 12 people that day. 11 rolled through that device, which, by the way, was a fake. There were no x-rays. That was just an empty box. But they didn't know that, and they rolled back and forth. One guy said, you know, I'm going to take a bus, and he left. Good for him. Yeah,
This is very funny and should be really scary. This is in a democratic culture. 11 out of 12 people obeyed someone who was not a legitimate authority, was proposing to be, and gave an absurd order, and it was complied with. So this takes us back to the very famous experiments on obedience by Dr. Stanley Milgram at Yale. And many of you probably encountered these at some point. However, I'm going to just refresh you on it because I find that people sometimes conflate it with some other experiments, and also that there are deeper levels of learning from this experiment than is typically taught. So, just to refresh you, in this experiment, there was the true subject did not know that he was the subject. There was an authority figure who was the experimenter. He had a lab coat and a clipboard. There was a learner, and the learner was thought to be the subject. He was not. He was part of the experiment. The purpose of the experiment, supposedly, was to discover if giving painful shocks for wrong answers could accelerate learning. Dubious proposition, but okay, one could at least assume that it was a real, legitimate experiment. So the actual subject, who we call the naive subject because he didn't know he was the subject, was sat down in front of a console with levers. And each lever was marked 15 volts, and in 15-volt increments went to 450 volts. And every time, and he was to read a question. If he got a wrong answer, he was to go to the next level of shock, all the way to 450 volts. Now, everyone sitting in this audience is saying, that's crazy. I would never obey that order, right? To go to 450 volts. Milgram did an experiment before he actually did the main experiment. And he got 3 different groups of people. One was psychiatrists, a group of psychiatrists, one was a group of students, one was a group of cross-section of adults. And he told them exactly what I just told you, what the experiment was going to be. And he asked them to state how far did they think they would go before they disobeyed. Look at this. No one thought they would go to 450 volts, just as no one here thinks you would. Almost nobody went beyond 240 volts. And yet, in the actual experiment, 2 out of 3 people went to 450 volts. This is a very important datum because what it says is even though we believe we are rational, good, moral people put in certain social situations and certain authority relationships, we can do what we did not believe we would do. Now, when I studied this, I said, well, okay, but what about the 1/3 that didn't obey? That's who I want to know. What do we want to know about them? What can we learn from them? And it turned out that Milgram couldn't find any correlation between their socioeconomic status, their religion, their class, etc. So he didn't go there. And it's assumed that we didn't learn all that much about the other third. I think that's wrong, and I'm going to reveal to you that I think Milgram's data did teach us something very important, which we need to teach. But before I do that, I want to share with you a few variations of his basic experiment. So in the basic experiment, the victim, the learner, was in the next room. So the subject, when the learner got to about 180 volts, and this was an actor, so he was not really getting shocked. But when he got to about 180 volts, he would start saying, oh, this hurts more than I thought it would. I don't want to continue, okay? And I'm going to show you what happened after that. But the actual subject can only hear the reactions of the learner. When Milgram changed the conditions and put the learner in the same room so that the subject could see the pain on their face, obedience dropped to 40%. When he changed the condition further and required that the subject place the learner's hand on the shock pad, it dropped to 20%. So we're finding that as you introduce humanity into this, obedience does tend to drop. There are a couple of very important other variations that I think we need to learn from. In one of the variations, instead of having the subject do all 3 tasks of read the question, evaluate the right answer or wrong answer, and deliver the shock, he divided that task between 3 people. 2 were Confederates. But he arranged it so that it was, without being obvious, it was always the subject that was giving the shock. When the other 2 expressed discomfort with what was happening and refused to go on at a certain point. Obedience dropped to 10%. This is a very important point because it shows that peer modeling is extremely important. You may find somebody who's the first person to stand up and say, this isn't right, and maybe the next person, and that helps the third person and the fourth person to then start listening to their own conscience and values. Even more important, I believe, is when he changed the conditions so that there were two authority figures, both in lab coats, both with clipboards, and at a certain point, one started to argue with the other, saying, I'm not sure that this is as safe as we thought it was. I don't think we should continue. And the second one said, no, I think we must continue. No, I don't think we should. Obedience went to 0. Why is this important? Because in our culture, we consider it bad form for two authorities to argue in front of a junior person, you see. Maybe we need to reconsider that. Maybe we need to understand that at times that's actually an appropriate action that would save everyone from going down a very problematic path. There's one other condition that he changed, which to me is the most problematic, and particularly from a modern warfighting perspective. I'm not even sure what we should do with this, but I think it's important for you to know it and perhaps add it into your own dialogue and debates and questioning. And that is that when he made the subject be the person who just read the questions, he didn't have to administer the shock. 92% went to 450 volts. Most of us are not the person pulling the trigger. Most of us are an analyst or in some other supportive role. Does that relieve us from moral accountability? These are important questions for us to address. There are not easy answers here, but they're very important questions. So I said to you, I wanted to know, what did those who disobeyed do differently? And I believe that Milgram's data showed us clearly what they did differently. So this is a 4-step process, and it's the 4th step that distinguishes the obedient from the disobedient, the appropriately disobedient, given the experiment. So in the first step, the subjects cooperated. This was a social science experiment. It seemed to have a social value. I'll cooperate with this. In the next step, when the learner starts to experience discomfort and says, this is more painful than I thought, I'm not sure I want to continue here, the subject turns to the authority figure and says, are you sure this is okay? Are you sure we should continue? And the experimenter says, yes, we must continue. They were only allowed to say 5 scripted things. So the subject would continue. In the third phase, the strain became so severe. The subject, the learner, was pounding on the wall saying, let me out of here. I have a heart condition. I refuse to continue. Now, the subject had this moral dilemma. Should they continue despite the evidence in front of their eyes? Or should they follow the authority figure? And they would now say, I don't think we should continue. And the authority figure would say, you must continue. The experiment requires you continue. There is no permanent tissue damage being done. Please continue. Now remember, this authority figure did not have a gun to their head, did not control their paycheck and their livelihood. They simply had the symbols of authority. and 2/3, as we know in the basic experiment, resolved the situation. The psychological strain was so severe that this is no longer considered an ethical experiment. You cannot get approval to do this. It was so severe that they had to resolve the strain. And they could do it in one of two ways. They could do it by reducing the divergence between themselves and the authority figure and simply saying, he's the authority, I'm just going to do what he says. The strain resolves, but the unethical behavior continues. Or they could resolve the strain by amplifying the divergence and saying, I don't care that you are the authority figure. I have my moral values. This person is in danger of being harmed or killed. I'm not going to continue to obey. That also reduced the strain. But now you had an ethical response to the situation. So those who stopped obeying did so early. In other words, they amplified their divergence early. So I submit that those of us in all industries, but certainly in industries where, not industries, but activities where life and death are at stake, that we all need to understand and perhaps be prepared in a situation like that. It is not enough to resolve our psychological strain. Do we do it in a way that also has an ethical outcome? Now, what Milgram distilled from this was that there are two states from which we act. One is the autonomous state. That's where we make the decision on what to do and not to do, and therefore we hold ourselves accountable for that decision. That's the adult state that we usually operate in. He named another state which unfortunately has not gotten into our lexicon, which he calls the agentic state. And that is where we are acting as an agent on behalf of an authority figure, and therefore we do not feel responsible for the choices being made. That is the dangerous state. In other words, we must always hold ourselves accountable. Whatever choice we make, and sometimes the choices are very difficult, it's not totally clear what is the right choice to make. Like that nurse, we could make a serious error either way, but we have to hold ourselves accountable. We know from the Nuremberg trials, we can never say, I was just following orders. So let me do this. Because we have this wonderful experimental technology that you have, let me take a breather for about 60 seconds and have you reflect on this. And if you have a question about it, why don't you type it in so that Lloyd can start to see what kinds of questions are being generated here. And remember that this also has the feature that if someone else asks a question but you like it, you can like it. And then Lloyd will know, well, are there 30 people in the room who would like to hear that question answered? Are people prepared to do this? Do you have yourself set up to do it? Not everybody is. Well, let's give those who are a minute, and then we'll carry on. Okay, I see a number of people still typing. I'm assuming you're not chatting with your friends on Facebook. But let's move on here because we want to leave enough time for the Q&A. So we've established that there is a danger with authority relationships. What Milgram was a social scientist. He was not in the field of training. You are in the field of training. You are training leaders, you are training officers, and I contend that there are ways to train, just as there are guide dogs, to train this facility so that it is within reach, easier reach in the military culture that you're in. And I'm going to use a very solid real-world example we have on this. And it comes from the aviation industry, and there may be some aviators in the room. In the 1970s, there was a rash of fatal airline crashes, jumbo jets. And either everyone died or there were just a few survivors. And it was imperative to get to the common denominator. And the analysis showed that it was not mechanical error that was the main factor. It was human error. And the main human error was communication error. That communication broke down in the cockpit or between the cabin and the cockpit crew. Why did it break down? Well, most pilots had come from a military background. And if the captain was doing something incorrect and the non-flying pilot saw it, they were very reticent about speaking up. You don't correct your commanding officer. That's the culture. But the black box recordings found that in almost all cases, the non-flying pilot or another crew member saw the safety problem, tried to alert the captain. The captain blew them off for whatever reason. Either they were just exerting rank, their internal authority rules, if you will, or they were preoccupied with other checklist items, or perhaps they were having, a difficult day. They were ill or something. In any case, you would read these transcripts, and a minute and 20 seconds later, everybody dies. So to remedy this, the airline industry instituted what they call crew resource management training. And it was so successful that it was adopted by all civil aviation, all military aviation, and now there are varieties of it for ships as well. It's called bridge resource management. And people are put into simulators, and an anomaly occurs. And everybody in the simulation knows at least two things, or more than this, but I'm going to emphasize these two things. One, if you see something wrong, you say it. You don't assume the captain sees it because it's right in front of you. You say it. Even if you're the junior person on that craft, you say it. And secondly, you have to say it assertively enough to get command's attention. You can't do it weakly because the situation's too urgent. You have to overcome the natural rule sets of not talking assertively to superior officers in order to maintain the safety of the craft. This program was so successful in reducing airline fatal accidents that it has become the gold standard. I'm going to show you a video of a reenactment of one of these disasters. And I want you to pay attention to the non-flying pilot and his failure to use clear language early enough to get command's attention. I have one slide before I show you the video, because I'm going to give you a definition here. You all know what assertive language sounds like. It's not aggressive, it's clear, it's forthright. Here's an example. We need to request priority landing now. Linguists tell us that there is another form of language which is called mitigating language. Mitigating means to soften what you're saying. Sometimes it's called diplomatic language because it is an important tool to use in the right situation. But used in the wrong situation, it can be fatal. So, for example, the same assertive quote, "We need to request priority landing now," in mitigating language might sound like this. I wonder if perhaps we should request a higher landing priority. That is insufficient in that situation to deal with the safety issue. So listen for this language now in the video.
Check is done down to the airspeed bugs.
We can witness the fatal combination of the macho type and the non-assertive type in this training film. It's a reconstruction in a simulator using voice transcripts from a serious accident that actually happened to a major airline.
Here comes glide slope.
Watch out for the way the flight engineer in the seat nearest us and the captain, John, on the left, gang up on the young co-pilot in the front right. They're just about to begin their final descent.
17. Maybe gate 17, John.
Oh, good. That's right by that little snack bar.
Yeah, good gate.
Yeah,
Good
well, we
gate.
got about a half hour on the ground. We can run in there, get something to eat, get the weather, and be on our way to Seattle.
Good.
Below the glide slope there, John. Yeah, well, we know where we are out here. We're all right.
Oh, you waited. The Fox is going to have it wired.
I hope so.
Right in.
Oh, yeah. No problem. This a little faster than you normally fly this, John? Oh, yeah, but it's nice and smooth. We're going to get in right on time, maybe a little bit ahead of time. We got it made. Sure hope so.
You know, John, you know the difference between a duck and a co-pilot?
What is the difference?
Well, a duck can fly.
Well said. Seems like there's a little bit of a tailwind up here, John. Yeah, we're saving gas. Help us get in a couple minutes early, too.
In fact, they're less than 8 miles out, going 40 knots too fast and 200 feet too low.
John, you're just a little bit below the MDA here. Yeah, well, we'll take care of it here.
The captain's answer to being too low is to casually leapfrog the aircraft up over the glide slope in a last-minute attempt to correct. It's a fatal maneuver.
Going just a little bit high. Well, gear down. Final check.
No smoking signs.
It's on.
Flight and nav instruments.
They're cross-checked. 2 degrees.
Landing gear.
It's down 3 green.
Speed brakes.
Really look awful high, John.
Speed
5
brakes.
degrees. 5 degrees. 15 degrees.
15.
25 on the flaps. 25.
John, you're really high. You're
25
going
on
to
the
need
flaps.
40 is what you need here.
Get the speed
Better
brakes
get
in.
this thing down. They're armed.
You want the speed brakes on?
I don't think you're going to make it, John, if you don't get this sucker on the ground.
Get it on, John.
You're not going to make
There
it.
we go.
You're not going to make it.
Oh, we're going around.
Oh, damn. 140.
Everybody died. You heard the mitigating language, and it went on too long, and it only became assertive language too late. So you have to really gauge when do you use that assertive voice, despite the discomfort of doing so within the hierarchical culture. So I'm very going to quickly, at the danger of overloading this talk, just very briefly, in my courageous follower model, we have two vectors. How fully do you support leadership, and how willing are you to speak up candidly when needed? And depending on that mixture, we get 4 styles of followership. And it can be useful to actually take this little self-assessment to get a sense of your own followership style. Very briefly and inadequately, I will say that the lower left hand is low support and low willingness to question or challenge. This person is a resource. They will do certain tasks, but they don't do more than that to contribute to the team. In the lower right, you have low support again, but high willingness to speak candidly. This person is not afraid of authority. They don't care who's in the room. They're going to speak their mind. The problem is, because their support is so low, every time they speak up, they're speaking up as the naysayer, and they get sidelined. On the upper left, we have the implementer. Sorry, just let me go back here for a moment. We have the implementer, high support, relatively low willingness to question or speak candidly. Implementers keep the world running. If the job can get done within the existing resources, the implementer will get it done. So it's a very strong place to be in terms of your career. The problem is, if a leader only values the implementer style, sooner or later, when he or she is about to make a wrong decision, there's no one who will speak up assertively enough to let them know that. So what we want to try to do is build that capacity to support brilliantly, but also speak up in dissent when necessary. And the way that maps to intelligent disobedience, I suggest, is this. A resource, you tell them what to do, they'll obey, but they'll obey blindly, not thoughtfully, and that will have certain consequences. The individualists will tend not to obey, will tend to resist, but because they're always resisting, they are not really helpful in terms of the team. The implementer will intelligently obey. All right, you want me to do this, my resources are limited, let me think about how I can redesign the process, how I can work out different priorities, how we can bring in some more resources. They will, if at all possible, get the job done. But it's the partner who will recognize when the job can't be done, or at least can't be done with sufficient safety, with efficient integrity, and they will intelligently disobey. The partner has all the virtues of the implementer and then some. That's what we're trying to, as leaders, develop in the people we serve as leaders. Let's very briefly, I want to bring this to a conclusion so we have some time for questions. But I want to quickly walk through. So what is intelligent disobedience? What are the elements? I'm going to go back to the guide dog model for a moment, but you see how it maps to the human model. Observe the risk. Pause the action. Don't instantly obey. Resist obeying if, until you can judge for yourself, is this safe to do? Obviously, particularly in the military, you have to do things that are not safe. But is it, in other words, is it putting ourselves into unnecessary harm in order to achieve the objective? And what guide dogs are taught is not only to disobey, but let's say that the blind person goes to the train station every day to commute into London, and usually the train lines up here, so he starts to walk towards where the door should be, and for that day the train is not lined up right. The dog is trained to counterpull, to actually pull the leader in the opposite direction. That may be something you may need to have to do. Also, the guide dog can't just leave the blind person stranded. So again, if they're walking to the train station every day, but yesterday there was a big storm and there are trees down and power lines down, the guide dog must not obey, but he can't leave the person standing there. He's got to find an alternative, if possible, to reach the goal of getting to the train, but at least to keep the leader safe. The dog can go under the barriers. The dog can jump over it. It has to know the leader can't. And it has to find a path. In other words, it now assumes the leadership role, finds the safe path, executes it, and then returns the lead to the natural leader in the team. Those are the elements. Now, we all have blind spots. So this metaphor extends beyond those who are just legally blind. And the higher up you go in your organization, the bigger are your blind spots. You're further removed from the action on the ground, from the context on the ground. And if you give a wrong order that's executed, the damage you do is much greater because of the size of, the vehicle, if you will, that you are commanding. So what, as a leader, is the smart response? And this is important too, because it's not just the dog that's trained. The blind person has to be trained as well. Otherwise, they will not utilize the dog's intelligent disobedience to keep them safe. So as a leader, you have to pay attention. If you are getting dissent or even disobedience from someone who usually complies, that's a big flag for you to pay attention. We, as human beings, will tend to react. What do you mean you're not going to do it? You've got to manage your reactions and instead recognize these are professionals in your team who are trying to alert you to a danger. You've got to be willing to probe your blind spots, asking really good questions. Help me see what you're seeing. What am I missing that you're seeing? Until you really understand what they are trying to warn you about. The mission must always be more important than your own status. You do not lose status because you rescind an order that you gave, if it is right for the mission. So you evaluate the risk or the opportunity, because the dissent you're getting may be pointing you in the direction of an opportunity that you are not seeing. Change the order if warranted, but whether you change the order or not, thank the team member for the courage to have spoken candidly in dissent. If you do that, you will build a culture of intelligent disobedience. Now, I'm going to give you two last things before we end off here. A very real-world example of this happened very recently in the U.S. with the T-45 Goshawk training program. The Goshawk was having oxygen problems. Above a certain altitude, the air was becoming toxic, and there were a number of near fatal incidents. They were not getting corrected. So over 100 flying instructors said to their command, "We will not fly this plane until this is remedied." The response that they got from their senior officers, I think, was almost textbook perfect. If we, if we match it against the optimum reaction. Here is what was issued from their command. We take the concerns of our air crew seriously. We've directed a safety pause the action, for the community to allow time for leadership to engage with the pilots, hear their concerns, discuss the risk mitigations, and correct the issues. In fact, what has come out of this at this point is that command instructed the pilots to resume flying, but not above 10,000 feet, until the deeper problem could be addressed. That was a very rational response. But many, many people will not be willing to take what they consider the risk of speaking up to command. I'm going to tell you one last story before I turn it over to Lloyd for questions. This was a real story told to me. It's kind of an American story, but you translate it into your culture. A guy came up to me after a talk like this, and he said, I was a lieutenant at the time, and I reported every day to a captain. And this captain was very rigid. Every day he gave me the 10 things that I was to do. And if I had something that I thought was equally or more important, and I would tell him that, he would say, you get my 10 things done, and if you have time, you can do yours. The captain rotates out. New captain comes in. Lieutenant reports for duty, and the captain gives him an order. Lieutenant says, yes, sir, and turns to leave, and the captain says, hold it. Did what I tell you make sense? Yes, sir. Did it really make sense? Well, sir, not fully, because of this and this and that. The captain says, we have to get something straight. If I give you an order that doesn't make sense, I cannot have you going out and implementing that order. You must tell me. And the lieutenant said, yes, sir. He said, no, that's not good enough. We're going to drill this. And he said, you're going to stand here, and I'm going to give you an order that doesn't make sense. And you're going to tell me, sir, that's BS. He said, what? We're going to do it. So he gave the order, and the lieutenant, he said, I could hardly get the words out of my mouth. This was so against my training. And he said, sir, that's BS. He said, okay, come on, do it again. Until he could do it, as well as he could say, yes, sir, he could say, sir, that's BS. Okay. A couple of weeks go by. He reports to the captain, and the colonel is in the office. The colonel has a nephew on base. The nephew misappropriated a military vehicle. The colonel is trying to make this go away. The captain explains to the lieutenant what they're trying to do. And the lieutenant says, sir, that's BS, sir. And the colonel goes, what did he say to you? And the captain says, sir, I'll handle this. And he put his arm around the lieutenant and said, you did great. Get out of here before he kills you. You know, what does it take to actually make this a living reality? I'll stop there. And I think now the thing is to take another minute or two break. You can stretch, and you can put in any other questions. And we'll give Lloyd a couple of minutes to digest that, and then we'll do the Q&A. Okay, thank you. Thanks.